We're going to talk about a case study showing a specific electric company's challenges and logistical efforts to restore power following Superstorm Sandy. This is the third of 3 webinars dedicated to power restoration. And I'm Laura Johnson. I'm the manager of meetings and events for the All Hazards Consortium. We're a nonprofit association focused on homeland security and emergency management issues and guided by the Mid-Atlantic region. I'll be administering today's webinar, but before we begin, I just wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. First, this webinar will be recorded for use by the All Hazards Consortium, and everyone will receive a PDF copy of the slides after the webinar is over. If you dialed on today to the audio portion of the webinar, you will be in listen-in mode only. But if you logged on using the GoToWebinar platform and dialed in with your 2-digit PIN, your phone has been muted upon entry, but we can unmute it later during the Q&A if you have any questions. And there's really 2 ways to participate in the Q&A. One is you can raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon in the window panel that appears on your screen. And again, we'll unmute your phone when we're ready for your question. Or the easiest way is to send questions to our webinar staff through the questions panel. You just type in your question and click send. So let's go ahead and get started. And to kick things off, I have the pleasure of introducing Tom Moran, who is the Executive Director of the All Hazards Consortium. Tom?
Thank you, Laura. Let me welcome everyone to our last of 3 webinars for the Power Sector Series. First, let me thank Tony Torphy for taking the time to do this. This is a busy time for all the folks in the energy sector. Today's webinar is really designed to give you insight into what some of the people go through that respond to these types of events, and this will be a fascinating webinar. The purpose of these webinars is to help educate state, local officials, legislators, public and private sector leaders into some of the things they may not typically know about or understand that happens on the private sector side and in response to these types of major events. This is just one case study. I'm sure there are many, but I think you'll find it very interesting. So with that, I wanted to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Tony Torphy from Con Ed. Tony?
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This afternoon, I'd like to talk about Con Edison's preparation and response to Superstorm Sandy and some of the changes that we're going to implement going forward. Okay, so on the agenda, I'm going to talk about storm preparations, a little bit about Sandy's scope and intensity, the impact, both societal impact, but also the impact to Con Edison's energy delivery systems. And then I'll talk about the restoration efforts and then the plans that we have for changes going forward. So storm preparations, if you could go to the next slide. So on October 24th, based on the National Weather Service forecast, we initiated our corporate coastal storm plan. That's a plan that we developed after Katrina back in 2005, 2006. That plan basically lays out the organization for the company to respond to a major coastal storm. So some of the things that we did to prepare, so we identified pumping contractors and vendors that could provide spare supplies. We identified the locations where we thought we would have flooding. We organized our staffing. We arranged for 24/7 staffing for all our employees. We deployed literally thousands of personnel to work around the clock. And we also did a lot of communication. So we communicated a lot of safety information through press releases. We did web updates. We did an email blast to 1.3 million customers. We contacted all the customers in our service territory that use life-sustaining equipment. And also we contacted all the critical care facilities to warn them of possible service outages. We secured deliveries of dry ice and wet ice in anticipation of significant customer outages. And we established our Corporate Emergency Response Center, which we organize under the Incident Command System. We find that that's very useful when we're coordinating with local and state government. In terms of our systems, we preemptively identified steam mains that were susceptible to flooding. We had to isolate those steam mains because if a steam main gets surrounded by water and it cools the steam, we can get a phenomenon called a water hammer, which can lead to a steam explosion. In terms of our electric system, we took out 3 electric networks in low-lying areas. We did that preemptively as the storm waters were rising. We also preemptively isolated primary feeders in 12 other networks, and those were feeders that we knew were susceptible to flooding. In our gas system, we secured gas supply and we prepared our LNG plants, our liquefied natural gas plants. We also shut down 4 of our gas regulators. If you go to the next slide, and the next slide again, please. Thank you. So Sandy, in terms of the scope and the size of the storm, it was the largest Atlantic storm on record, spanning about 800 miles. It caused more than 8.5 million power outages across 21 states. We had winds in our area sustained at 64 miles an hour and gusting to 90, and a storm tide at the battery that was over 14 feet. So the storm's impact on our service territory was twofold. We had powerful wind gusts, which brought down trees and power lines, and we also had an unprecedented 14-foot storm tide that breached shorelines and available flood protection measures. It inundated our facilities and a lot of our underground equipment. The next slide, please. So this is a photo that shows the FDR Drive as the highway approaches the South Ferry Terminal to Staten Island. It gives you an indication of the extent of the damage caused by the flooding. The storm tide of 14.06 feet exceeded all official forecasts, and it surpassed a historical record that was set in 1821 by nearly 3 feet. And it beat the 92 nor'easter, and folks will remember that as the perfect storm. In 92, we had a storm surge that was 4.5 feet lower than Sandy's storm surge. If you go to the next slide. So Sandy's impact, this is a photograph of some of the damage in Staten Island. The storm surge was the worst that we had ever seen. The next slide, please. This is an aerial view of the Rockaway Beach area, and that sustained extremely heavy damage from Sandy. This image was taken on November 11th, 2012. The next slide. In terms of the transportation infrastructure, all New York City subway and ferry service was disrupted for several days. Most major automobile tunnels and bridges were closed, including the Brooklyn, Manhattan, Williamsburg, George Washington, and the Tappan Zee bridges, and the U Carey Brooklyn Battery Tunnel and the Holland Tunnel. And once the roadways reopened, they had many restrictions. JFK and Newark Liberty airports were also closed, and they did not reopen until October 31st. LaGuardia was closed and reopened on November 1st. So the photographs here, the top one is the South Ferry subway station. As you can see, that got flooded, and significant damage there to that subway station. And the bottom image shows some Metro-North Railroad cars that were stranded by flooding. The next slide, please. So Sandy's impact from the perspective of hospitals. And the photo here shows some patients being evacuated from Bellevue Hospital. So there were a number of hospitals, Coney Island, Bellevue, NYU, Langone. Hospitals were all evacuated. NYU Downtown and Manhattan Veterans Affairs hospitals were closed, and elective admissions to 6 hospitals and 41 chronic care facilities were canceled. And then patients in other health care facilities had to be moved to higher ground. The next slide, please. Sandy's impact on some of the other infrastructure, so the schools were closed until November 2nd. The New York Stock Exchange suspended trading for 2 days. A lot of senior centers, public libraries, and city parks were closed. Broadway shows were canceled. and the first Brooklyn Nets game at Barclays Center was postponed. And the photograph here is Central Park, and those are some of the trees that were blown over in Central Park. So this is a photograph that was taken close to our East River generating station and our East River transmission substation, so you can see some of the damage. We actually evacuated most of the vehicles from that workout location. Working with New York City OEM, we were able to obtain a staging area around Union Square, and we moved most of our vehicles out of that area. However, the salt water caused extensive damage. The next slide, please. So this is the impact on our electric system. So we lost about 4,000 megawatt of generation. There were 5 transmission substations that went out of service, 14 Manhattan networks, and a network is it's an underground energy delivery system where we have multiple feeders feeding multiple network transformers, all tied to customers. So they pretty much provide a very reliable service, but once they go down, it's very difficult to bring them back up. Unlike a radial system where customers are interrupted and it's fairly easy to make repairs and pick the customers back up, on a network system it's a lot more difficult. You have to coordinate the restoration much more closely. So in addition to the 14 Manhattan networks, we lost a network in Brooklyn, and also in Staten Island we lost 3 area substations. And all of this was caused by flooding. The next slide, please. So one of the things that happened during Sandy was there was a YouTube video. It was an arc, and it looked like an explosion. And it went viral on YouTube for a while. A lot of people thought that that's what blacked out lower Manhattan. In reality, that was a lower level voltage, a lower voltage level incident. It was a circuit breaker that was connected to a transformer that failed because of exposure to salt water. It was very dramatic, but it actually didn't cause the blackout in Manhattan. What caused the blackout in downtown Manhattan was flooding in the relay controls in our substation at East 13th Street. If you go to the next slide. So this slide shows the lower portion of Manhattan. The areas in yellow, that's Fulton Network and Bowling Green Network, those areas we knew as the tide was coming up. We knew a couple of hours before high tide that the tide was going to be higher than was predicted. We had plans in place to preemptively de-energize those 2 networks. The networks in red, those networks lost power because of a flooding situation at East 13th Street, at our East 13th Street substation, and that's where relay cabinets were flooded. Even though we have flood protection at that substation, the flood protection goes to 12 feet. We had about 14 feet, so it overwhelmed the flood barriers. The next slide. If you go to the next slide. This shows the damage in the relay cabinets, and this is what caused the blackout. Go to the next slide. The impact on our steam system, we lost about 1/3 of our steam customers, which is about 561 customers. We had to isolate about 30 miles of steam main to prevent some catastrophic damage. The flooding overcame the protective barriers around some of the critical equipment that we had, including 59th Street and 74th Street, and the First Avenue steam tunnel. They all had to be shut down. In this photograph, we're restoring steam to a hotel in the financial district after Sandy. If we go to the next slide. Impact on the gas system, about 4,200 gas customers lost service. A lot of uprooted trees damaged gas services, and then the gas services had to be turned off. We also had some coastal flooding in the Bronx that prompted the isolation of gas services in that area. If you go to the next slide. Sandy's impact caused obviously significant damage to our overhead system. We worked with city and municipalities to clear the roads. Our first priority in the aftermath of a major storm like Sandy is to open the roads, clear any potential hazardous conditions such as energized wires down, and then restore critical infrastructure. And we work very closely with the municipalities in Westchester County here and also in New York City to identify those critical facilities. One of the things that we find is that what may be a critical piece of infrastructure in one storm may not be as critical in the next storm. For example, a sewage treatment plant may be really critical in a storm that brings a lot of rainfall, whereas it may not be as critical, particularly if there's an alternate process that the municipality or city can use. So we work with the municipalities and the city very closely, and they identify for us the critical infrastructure on a case-by-case and storm-by-storm basis. So we try to coordinate as much as we can with the local officials. The photograph here, we have some crews that are repairing damaged utility poles in Westchester. And then the photograph here on the right shows some of the damage that was caused primarily by storm surge in Staten Island. The pole that's leaning over there was basically the ground underneath it was undermined. The next slide, please. So after Sandy and also the November 7th nor'easter, because Sandy didn't come by itself, if you recall, we had a storm on November 7th. That was a snowstorm, brought high winds and a couple inches of snow. Between Sandy and the November 7th nor'easter, we had more than 1 million customers without power. If you could go to the next slide. And the next one. So this is a kind of interesting picture. This is the Battery Park underpass, and it gives some idea of the kind of damage that was caused by the flooding. The next slide, please. So here we have what we call a restoration curve. So it shows the number of customers that we restored. The total customers interrupted was over 1.1 million. And we reached 100% restoration on November 12th. Now this excludes customers who were unable to receive service because of damage to their homes or businesses. So the customers whose homes were flooded, in many cases had to make repairs. We were not able to re-energize those homes because of the danger of starting a fire and you know, injuring somebody or causing property damage. So in many cases, those customers had to get electricians, had to make repairs to their homes and to their wiring. All told, Sandy affected more than 5 times the number of customers that we lost in Hurricane Irene. In Hurricane Irene, we had about 204,000 customers interrupted. In Sandy, it was over 1.1 million. And previously, Hurricane Irene was the worst storm in the company's history. So Sandy exceeded that by a factor of 4 or 5. So we established a global estimated restoration time on Friday, November 9th, and we accomplished restoration to 90% of our customers on November 7th, which was 2 days earlier than we had anticipated. Okay, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of our restoration strategy, I mentioned earlier that we try to coordinate as best we can with municipal and city officials. We also coordinated with FEMA through the Edison Electric Institute. Again, big focus was on public safety and then a prioritized approach to restoration. We also distributed dry ice, and when we ran out of dry ice, we also distributed wet ice. We set up command buses and outreach sites in those really hard-hit areas, and those are the areas that were primarily damaged by storm surge, and those were along the shore, the South Shore in Staten Island, and also in parts of Brooklyn. Throughout the restoration, we focused on public safety. Before a lot of the work could begin on our energy systems, the roads had to be cleared of fallen trees, down poles, and toppled power lines. And again, we coordinated much of that work with the local municipalities. When we restore service, we prioritize work that will benefit critical facilities and then work that will restore the greatest numbers of customers. And in the end, we have to work block by block and home by home to repair damage to individual homes. Throughout the restoration, we distributed 278 tons of dry and wet ice to customers throughout the region. By November 2nd, 3 days after the storm had hit, we had restored service to 50% of our customers, and then we had 90% back after 8 days. If you could go to the next slide, please. Many of the underground facilities, our manholes and our transformer vaults, they had to be pumped clear of water and debris, and then they had to be dried before the crews could begin the process of inspecting and repairing equipment and restoring service. And this shows a crew dewatering a manhole in Lower Manhattan. The next slide. So the restoration to the hardest hit areas, it's a continuous process. In many cases, we had damage to customer equipment, and we had to go through a certification process with the city and also with the customer's electricians. In the days that followed the storm, we coordinated with the authorities to speed up the certification process that verifies customers' equipment is safe to energize. This was a really large issue in the hardest hit communities. And part of the problem was when a storm surge affects a neighborhood, some of the houses were very badly damaged, and they had water in their basements and their electrical switchgear was submerged. And yet other houses that were built at a higher level did not have that kind of damage. So we had to go house by house with the inspectors, the building inspectors, and determine which houses we could re-energize and which houses we had to disconnect. And the customers that we could re-energize, we were not in a position to re-energize them until we had inspected all the homes in that damaged area, because if we turned on the power to all the homes, because the power was out to all the homes, if we turned on the power, we would be energizing homes that had damage. So we had to actually get to every single home before we could restore customers that were on that particular feeder. The next slide, please. So no utility has enough resources to restore power after a major storm like Sandy. We have a process that we call mutual assistance. And mutual assistance allows us to borrow line workers from other utilities to help us when we have events like Sandy. And we reciprocate. We send crews down to Florida for many of the hurricanes down in Florida. We sent crews down to Louisiana and New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina. So we brought in about 5,700 mutual assistance workers and contractors, and we brought them from as far away as California and as far north as Canada, and also as far south as Florida and Texas. We had to establish base camps. We couldn't find hotel rooms for 5,700 workers. If you recall, in the immediate aftermath of Sandy, the New York Marathon was scheduled to be run. Many of the hotel rooms in New York City were already booked by marathon runners and their families. So we actually set up base camps. We contracted with vendors to set up sleeping trailers and food tents and various other support showers and toilets and things like that. We established 5 base camps. They were able to house about 4,000 or 5,000 of the workers. This photograph is of a location. It was one of the base camps. It's a 1,000-person base camp, and it was in Rye Playland here in Westchester County in New York. You can see some of the rides in the background there to the left. But the trucks, you can see the trucks there from basically all around the country, from as far west as California. We have never created base camps for mutual assistance workers before. This was the first for us as a company. We also brought in some people to help us run the base camps. We contacted through the Edison Electric Institute and the Mutual Assistance process. We were able to bring in some utility management people who had actually had a lot of experience running base camps. Group of folks came up from Flower to Power Light to help us set that up. If you could go to the next slide, please. So one of the things we did was we brought crews from California. Now, some of the crews and their vehicles were flown in, and this is a photograph of a utility truck. I believe that's Southern California Edison, and they were flown in by military aircraft. We also trucked in utility trucks from San Francisco and from California. And how we trucked them in was we put them on lowboys, and we double-teamed the drivers, and we had the trucks run 24 hours a day. And they actually got here in about 3.5 days from California, which was pretty good. They got here, believe it or not, before the trucks that were flown. It took us a while to get through, to get high enough on the priority list for the military to fly our equipment. So the trucks that came by land actually arrived about a day before the trucks that came by plane. Go to the next slide, please. So the November 7th nor'easter caused additional customer outages and setback restoration efforts. It took another 5 days to get back all the customers after the November 7th nor'easter. So in just about 2 weeks, we had restored a total of 1,115,000 electric customers who lost power due to Sandy and the nor'easter. For our overhead systems, we restored an average of 1,000 customers per hour during Superstorm Sandy, as compared to less than 800 customers per hour on average from Hurricane Irene. And by November 12th, we had restored power to all the customers who could accept power. Next slide, please. Communications, obviously, communications is a critical piece of our restoration plans. We need to let our stakeholders and our customers know as much information as we can. Some of the things that we did from a communication perspective, we did an outreach to customers, elected officials, city agencies, municipalities, regulators, and the media. In terms of social media, prior to Sandy, we had 6,500 Twitter followers. After Sandy, we had more than 23,000 Twitter followers. Our press releases were retweeted more than 2,500 times. We created 25 videos about storm preparation and response, and they were viewed by more than 100,000 people. And we also had about 140,000 views on Flickr of our restoration efforts. We have a lot of videos about storm preparation and response, and many of them are on YouTube. Our call centers handled more than 1.2 million calls, and the company called about 1.4 million customers. The next slide, please. So at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the changes we're implementing going forward. So going forward, we have to take a more coordinated approach to the evaluation and implementation of the solutions. We need to work with all levels of government, regional transportation organizations, environmental organizations, climate scientists, and urban planners. We've actually brought in some climatologists to take a look at what the latest state-of-the-art in climatology thinks is in store for the New York City area over the next several decades. We've also worked with New York City OEM. They have a climate task force. We've been working with the city to make sure that we integrate our plans with the city plans. Some of the things that we're doing, we're working with other leaders in the region to evaluate how to help protect our critical infrastructure and services. We're conducting a comprehensive review of our systems, and we're considering new initiatives. We're reassessing the coastal flood zones. We're developing our next generation of storm plans. We're also looking at more extensive shutdown of key facilities. We are prioritizing potential design changes for each of our commodities, electric, gas, and steam. And we've committed about $250 million specifically on measures that can help protect critical infrastructure from flood damage. So in addition to raising critical infrastructure, critical equipment such as relay houses, we're also looking at installing stronger barriers and additional flood pumps. The next slide, please. So we're looking to harden the circuits that feed our critical load. We're also looking at and revisiting the possibility of burying our overhead lines underground. There are some issues with that. I think we went forward. Could you go back one, please? Okay, thank you. So we're also looking at revisiting the possibility of burying our overhead wires, but there are some issues, and the issues are cost. It's much more expensive to install and to maintain underground wires versus overhead wires. And also, it takes about 60% longer to repair underground equipment once it develops a fault. We're looking at new overhead designs. One of the things we're looking at is a special breakaway connector that we could use on a house service at the pole end, so that if a tree branch falls on the service, instead of pulling it away from the house or instead of pulling the pole over, the connector would break and allow the service wire, which would be de-energized at that point, to fall without causing further damage. We're looking at things like spacer cable, for example, to be used in locations where there's heavy foliage. We're developing and installing new overhead switches to help isolate damaged equipment. Next slide, please. So as we go forward, excuse me, we're planning to review all our options, collaborate with key stakeholders, and continue to improve our communications with our stakeholders, both before, during, and after storms. And we remain focused on strengthening our systems to help withstand extreme weather. We're going to refine our contingency plans for future emergencies and natural disasters and continue to invest wisely in our energy delivery systems. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Tony, thank you very much. As a reminder, this is our Q&A period, and there are two ways to participate in this part of the webinar. If you hit your hand icon, that'll tell me you want your phone unmuted, and we can have you ask your question over the phone. And you can also type in your questions. We've received a few so far, so I'll go ahead and start with those. Tony, someone wanted to know, what is a STEAM customer?
A STEAM customer, we have about 1,900 STEAM customers in Manhattan. A lot of the large buildings in Manhattan, the Empire State Building, a lot of the buildings in downtown, also the hospitals in the city, they utilize steam from our district heating steam system. We have the largest district heating steam system in the world. And if you can think about Manhattan, the real estate is so valuable. Putting in a plant to generate hot water and to generate steam, and then putting in a flue or a chimney for that would take up a lot of space in a building like the Empire State Building. So it makes a lot of sense for those customers to take steam from a centralized plant. And our steam system is pretty old. And basically, it uses waste heat from the generation of electricity to create steam. So a lot of hospitals and a lot of the major buildings are steam customers.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I just unmuted the phone for James Walden. So, James, if you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit about lines that disconnect when pressure from trees is going down. Can you kind of explain a little bit about how that works, and like how frequently are you replacing connections with that type of system?
Thank you. Yeah. So the thinking is that we would develop a connector that would break at a certain point. Most of the time, the connectors that we make now are physically very strong, and obviously they have to be electrically strong as well. So and normally you'd want that. You would not want high voltage wires particularly falling if at all possible. But for service wires that go from the pole to the house, typically what happens when a branch or a tree falls on that service wire, it usually rips the standpipe from the house, causes a lot of damage to the customer's property. It damages the siding typically, and the customer then has to make repairs both physically to the wood and the siding, but also they have to get an electrician to repair the standpipe. So the breakaway connector, we think, would avoid that damage. It would disconnect the service. It would create a weak link, basically, and the weak link would be on the pole side, away from the customer's home. That's the thinking. I don't know that we've installed any of them yet, but those are some of the things that we're looking at.
Yeah, that I think is a fantastic idea. Then the line that falls is not dangerous to anybody because there's no connection. That has a lot of benefits to that.
Yeah, that is correct. The line would be de-energized because it would fall from the pole end.
We received another written question here, Tony. How did you address interoperable communication challenges to permit trucks and crews from various regions and international resources to transmit and receive messages from one another?
That's a very good question. How we do that is we have a concept called a crew guide. So with every group of external resources, whether they're crews from California or contractors, with every group, we embed with them a Con Edison employee. We use our active duty employees, the employees that are working, but we also have a large number of retirees that we can call upon. And the retirees will come back and work for us during storms to fulfill that role. And those crew guides, they have all the proper communication equipment. They know who to call. They know the protocols. They know the lockout, tagout procedure. They've, in many cases, they were first-line supervisors in our overhead regions or in our underground regions. So that's primarily how we do that. We do have our own radio system. We have our own telephone system, our own fiber optic system. So we have a pretty good redundant telecommunications capability within the company. And we serve such a small area in terms of physical size. Our service area is only about 625 square miles. So it's a very small area, so we can cover it pretty good with radio and telecommunications.
Great. You talked a little bit, Tony, about how you coordinated with the local municipalities. We had some questions and chatter about that, some more information perhaps you can share with us, such as were you in the EOC there? How did that work? What was your role there? And also, how did you communicate with state and local government, as well as other sectors, such as food, water, et cetera?
Okay, so how we communicate with the city and the local governments, we have a liaison program. We have a team of liaisons that we dispatch to New York City OEM, to their EOC. We will dispatch to One Police Plaza, to the police department when they stand up their EOC. We also send a liaison to 60 Control here in Westchester, which is the Fire and Ambulance Dispatch Center for Westchester County. If the Westchester County EOC is stood up, we will send a liaison there. In addition to that, every municipality that we serve in Westchester County, at their request, if they wish to have a liaison, we will dispatch a liaison to their EOC as well. And in some cases, their EOC may be, police department. It may not be a dedicated EOC. It could be a fire station, et cetera, for some of the smaller liaisons, or some of the smaller municipalities. So the liaisons, when they are deployed, they have laptop computers, they have air cards, they have access to all the systems that they need to get information on things like customer outages, where the customers are out, how the municipalities is impacted. So those liaisons work very closely with the municipal authorities to determine, what's the most important road to get open, for example, what's the most important piece of critical infrastructure that they need to get restored. They work very closely with the municipalities, and we've been fine-tuning that program over the last number of years. Pretty much every time we have a major event like that, we will get together with the municipalities and we'll ask for their feedback. We're not always perfect. I mean, there are things that we could do better, but I think overall the program's very successful. I think it helps both us and it helps the municipalities. In terms of the other say industries and segments, we will typically do that through New York City OEM or through Westchester County. So in the New York City OEM, their situation room, and when they stand up their EOC, there are representatives there from all the various agencies, the city agencies. So you will have the New York City Housing Authority will be there, the Port Authority will be there, the Metropolitan Transit Authority will be there. In addition, there'll be organizations such as the Red Cross and those kind of folks. So it's really that's how we coordinate with those stakeholders.
And you also talked, Tony, about contacting your customers before this. I think it was before the storm, such as those that had life-sustaining equipment. How did you contact your customers?
So the way we contact our customers prior to severe weather, whether that's a heat wave or a predicted overhead type storm, we call. We have both primary, secondary, and even tertiary telephone numbers for all our life-sustaining equipment customers. So we call them. We have a voice response unit, and we basically it's an automated system that calls the customer. It provides the information. It gives them a heads up, if you like, that there's a possibility of severe weather and they may lose power, and it gives them some advice on what to do if they lose power. And they also have a special telephone number, and we give them that on the call as well, a special telephone number just for life-sustaining equipment customers. So that's basically how we communicate with them prior to the storm. Now, during the storm, if we predict that a life-sustaining equipment customer is out of service, we will call them to check on their status. If we're not able to get through on the first call, we'll typically call again within 20 or 30 minutes. If we can't get through on the second call, we will then refer that to the local police department in Westchester or to the NYPD in New York City, and we'll ask the police department to respond just to do a welfare check on the customer and make sure the customer's okay. If the police department is unable to respond because of their workload, then we will dispatch one of our employees to go knock on the door and make sure the customer's okay. So that's our process with our life-sustaining equipment customers. In terms of our critical facilities customers, we have they have dedicated by sector. What I mean by that is there's, for example, a company employee who's assigned to, let's say, all the hospitals in Lower Manhattan, and that person, we call them energy services representatives. That person, he knows all the facilities managers. He knows all the contacts for those facilities, and those are the folks who will reach out and call the critical facilities prior to the storm. They will also call out during the storm, and indeed, if the facility has a problem and loses power, they also have the number for the energy services rep that they can call to get information.
A lot of coordinating going on, huh?
Yep.
One more question about coordinating. Did you, and if so, how did you coordinate with the road or debris clearance activities of DOTs?
Yeah, that's something that we've, again, been refining over time. During Sandy, what we did was we assigned overhead crews basically to work with the municipalities. So for every muni liaison that was assigned to a municipality, we assigned them a number of overhead crews. And then our crews and the municipalities' crews typically work side by side. So they would go to a location together. Our crews would make the wires safe, and then the municipalities' crews would clear the road. The only problem with that, it does slow us down in terms of restoration, because while the municipality is clearing the road, they're cutting up the tree and they're getting in backhoes, et cetera, to remove the tree from the road. We're not able to use our crew for restoration. New York City, we did something similar. We have what we call the Down Tree Task Force in New York City. New York City puts together a task force which includes the fire department, the sanitation department, the parks department, and we also assign resources to that task force. So we will assign a bucket truck typically and some damage assessors, and it's a similar kind of process. The city will determine which is the highest priority jobs, and the task force will go out and work together to clear the street.
Okay, Tony, someone had asked here, can you describe how your overhead switches would be controlled in the event you want to isolate?
So we have both remote control switches, which we call SCADA switches, and SCADA, SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. So those switches can be controlled remotely from our control center, and they operate over a 900 megahertz radio system. So that's one way we can do that. Our substations are also automated. They have a frame relay communication system. We can open and close the breakers in our substations remotely. They have a backup radio system in case the frame relay system goes down. But we also have a lot of manual switches. So for the manual switches, we still have to dispatch a troubleshooter or an overhead crew to physically go out and open fuses or operate a switch.
Okay. Tony, do you have a specific office or group that takes requests for priority restoration from the federal government?
That would come to us, I would think that would come to us through New York City OEM. Typically we haven't, to the best of my knowledge, had a direct connection with the federal government. Our connection with the federal government has been through EEI, and during Sandy, one of the Edison Electric Institute employees was actually embedded in FEMA, so that we were able to communicate that way. We also have people embedded at the state level. So we had Con Edison representatives up at the state EOC, so we could get it that way. So I think it would have to come through either the state or the city. I don't know that we would have a direct connection, or through EEI.
Okay, I unmuted the phone for Mr. Mark Wantz. Mark, you can go ahead and ask your question. Mark, you still there? All right, let's go ahead and move on. Connie, how do you coordinate the funding in the mutual assistance response?
So for funding, in terms of payment, the investor-owned utilities through the Edison Electric Institute have a mutual assistance agreement. It's a formal agreement that's signed by the officers of the utilities. And in that agreement, it really lays out the responsibility both for liability and also for payment. And basically, when a company is asked to respond and assist us, we accept liability for their crews, pretty much as if they were our own crews. And we also agree to pay all their costs, including any costs for the preparation, and also for the travel to and obviously back to the responding company. I think I lost my...
Tony, were there any shortages of equipment or personnel after the Sandy and the nor'easter, or were you able to get everything you needed through mutual aid and contractors?
We eventually got everything we needed. There was a shortage of personnel, and I think it obviously wasn't just Con Edison, but all the utilities here in the Northeast, could have used more line workers early on. And we scrambled to get things like network protector, fuses, and various other things in the aftermath of Sandy. But I have to say, I don't think anything in terms of material affected the restoration, but definitely the lack of resources and having to bring resources from so far away as California impacts both the cost to restore power and also the length of time that it takes to restore power.
Speaking of the cost, Tony, how much did the storm cost? That's an interesting question.
I think the latest numbers we have is about $400 million, and that was the O&M cost. In terms of the storm hardening and some of the work that we're doing, planning to do going forward, I think we're talking in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars.
Before we try to get audio for Mr. Mark Want, he went ahead and typed in his question, which is, can you discuss or describe the coordination with state, local EOCs and the USACE for deployment of emergency generators?
Yeah, in terms of emergency generators, we have a fleet of emergency generators. To the best of my knowledge, most of them were deployed to support our systems and not individual customers. Most of the customers that have critical needs, such as hospitals, nursing homes, and things like the stock exchange, have their own backup generation. So I'm not sure that we would be involved in coordinating the deployment of generators to individual customers. We do that from time to time, but during a storm, generally, we do not have enough generators to do that.
Yeah. Okay, and someone also just asked about the auto disconnect technology you mentioned just previously, and if it was commercially available.
Yeah, the automation technology is commercially available. It's fairly expensive. Our load density is such here that we're highly automated, probably more so than most utilities, but it is available, and it's been out for a number of years. It's well proven.
Tony, can you describe the storm hardening work and planning that Con Edison completed prior to Sandy?
Sure. So since prior to Sandy, since the '92 nor'easter, which was the perfect storm, we raised some critical infrastructure. We upgraded some of the pumps that we had and the floodgates, particularly around our generating stations and our steam plants. We installed some protective moats. And then since Katrina, we developed and implemented a corporate coastal storm plan. We also changed our specifications so that new transformers and network protectors in the flood zones, they had to either be submersible or they had to be installed above flood level. Since the '92 nor'easter, we raised a lot of critical infrastructure. And then for the past 7 years, we implemented a policy requiring any new business in a flood zone. And again, this is on the customer side, to install submersible equipment, similar to what we require on our own system, or again locate their equipment at higher elevations. In terms of our overhead system, in 2006 we modified our tree trimming program. We changed the specification to a much more aggressive specification. In other words, we cleared back quite a bit more than we used to. We used to have a spec that was 10, 10, and 5, so we would go 10 feet above our wires and 10 feet to the side and 5 feet below. And then we went to a 15, 15, and 10, so we increased it by about 50% on the top and sides and 100% on the bottom. We also do monthly aerial inspections and ground patrols of our transmission line right-of-ways. And we've installed a lot of automation over the last number of years, so now we can operate breakers and switches and manage the grid remotely.
Okay, and could you please elaborate on your plan to work with regional transportation systems?
Well, I think, Laura, this is actually part of it. I mean, one of the things we're looking at is how do we get our mutual assistance resources here as quickly as possible. And in the past, we've had some issues with things like way stations and easy pass tolls and IFT stickers on for fuel. So we've been working with the Port Authority. We've been working with the All Hazards Consortium and anybody really that we can that will listen to us to try and reduce some of the obstacles in the way of moving resources here. I mean, I think that's probably the best example that I have.
Okay. And did you have any safety issues associated with homeowners or buildings that operate their own energy generation, like solar panels or?
No, typically the fixed installations like solar panels rarely create a problem because they're usually installed properly. Where we generally have problems is when customers in the middle of a storm or in the aftermath of a storm will go out, buy a generator, bring it home, and plug it in without going through a proper installation. So, you know, we've had situations, and unfortunately customers have had situations where they've had carbon monoxide poisoning. We've had situations where customers' generators have backfed into our system and energized conductors that should not have been energized. So that's something we always have to be careful of.
And, you know, Tony, we've actually received a ton of questions, more than we'll be able to get to over the webinar, so we can try to address them individually. But I do want to end on this one question. What advice can you offer businesses and government to better prepare for large storms and outages so they can become more resilient?
I think having a plan for when the lights go out, I think that's a big piece of it. We know that there's going to be storms in the future. We could build a system that is 99.9% reliable, but we probably couldn't afford it. So I think you have to have some defense in depth. So, you know, you have to have, whether it's backup power generation, whether it's uninterruptible power supplies, you know, whether it's alternate feeds. And the other thing I would say is to talk to the utility to understand how your critical infrastructure is supplied, what are the vulnerabilities, and you know, get some advice as to what they think would help, you know, if when the power does go out, because it will.
That's great advice, Tony. And I apologize to the callers whose questions we weren't able to get to. We will try to email you individually. We have your contact information and can do that. And several people also asked about getting audio for the webinar, and we are working on that, and once that's approved, we will send you a link to the webinar as well as a copy of the PDF slides that I had mentioned in the beginning of the webinar. So just give us a couple days to work on that. And Tony, I'd like to thank you for your time on today's webinar. We also received comments in the questions, not just questions, but statements of that it was an excellent webinar, and people appreciated your input. And I think we can tell that by the number of questions that we got for today. So thank you, Tony, and
thank you, Laura.
Yeah. And for everyone else, please visit us at our website at ahcusa.org. That's where we will post the webinar, as well as the two others that we did in the past couple of weeks on power restoration. So if you missed those, feel free to visit our website and also our Facebook page for All Hazards Consortium, where you can find out more information about what we're doing in this arena. And thank you for dialing in today. And this ends today's webinar. Have a great day.